Yes, here are your choices. There really are no other choices. You've got three basic worldviews to choose from as far as what explains reality and what's true or not. Theism, pantheism, and atheism. Now, there is panentheism, but that's kind of a subset of pantheism. There's also polytheism, but that's been widely discredited because you can't have more of one all-powerful being. Because if you've got more than one all-powerful being, then the being is no longer all-powerful. Therefore, there is no God at that point. So polytheism has been widely discredited. So you are left with these choices. There are no other options. Either theism is true, which means there is a God, or pantheism is true, which means the universe is God, and all of us are God, so to speak. That's the Shirley MacLaine theology. Or atheism, which is there is no God at all. Those are your choices. That's it. That's all you got as far as reality is concerned. It's one of those three, one of those doors, okay? And that's it. And we're going to look to see why we can trust that Christianity makes the most sense. Now, here's the arguments for a theistic God. I'm going to run through these. I'm going to use what's known as a syllogism. A syllogism is the basic model of logic. Now, logic is a class I didn't like to take in college because it had math in it, and I don't like math. Math and I don't get along, okay? I know that a pastor friend of mine actually says the heresy that math is beautiful. I think that's outrageous, okay? All right. But, you know, we need math people, so I'm happy for you. But anyway, but I will say this about math. Math is certain. You can go and look at a mathematical equation, and you can come to a conclusion and know that that conclusion is true because of the laws of logic. There's certainty in math. Likewise, there's certainty in logic. The way the syllogism functions is you put your premises together, and if your premises are sound, if they're constructed properly, and if they're correct, if they're factually correct premises, the conclusion necessarily follows, which means it must be true. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. The syllogism is a great tool to use when you're watching political speeches or political commercials. You can apply a syllogism to what the politician is saying. Most of the time, the politician gets an F on that, okay? Because you try to test the truth based on a logical syllogism, and you realize this politician is just blowing smoke, okay? Because they're just using sound bites and trying to stir up certain feelings and emotions. Advertisers do the same thing. The syllogism is the greatest way to test truth claims. So we're going to look at syllogisms here. All of these rest on the premise that there is such a thing as the law of causality. The law of causality states that for every effect, there must be a cause. Everything that begins to happen or that does happen must have a cause, all right? Every effect has a cause. That's the law of causality. That is the basis of all these arguments for God. If you accept that a syllogism is a legitimate way of testing the truth, and if you accept that the law of causality is true, then guess what? You're going to be stuck with God is real. It's logically irrefutable. Irrefutable. Now, many people will try to get around that by denying the law of causality. The problem with denying the law of causality is this. If you get rid of the law of causality, you've just lost all of science. All of science is out the window. Because science is based on the law of causality, the search for causes. Experimentation, all that's out the window. And you've lost mathematics. And you've lost archaeology and history and just about everything, every other study. So you can't do without the law of causality. So here we go. The first argument for God, my favorite, I think the best one, the most irrefutable one, is the cosmological argument, which is the first cause argument for God. Here it goes. I'm going to give you the syllogisms. If you want to write them down, great. If not, just email me later and I can email you the syllogisms. But here they are. Cosmological argument for God. Premise A, every effect, there is a cause. Premise B, the universe is an effect. The argument for that is the universe began to exist. All of science now, all of the scientific community now agrees that the evidence is so overwhelming that the universe began to exist. We've got radiation, we've got the afterglow from the quote-unquote Big Bang. You've got the fact that the universe is spreading out. You've got all kinds of evidence that points to the fact that the universe began to exist. You've got philosophical evidence such as you can't have an endless past. You can't say an endless past. For example, take the sun. We know the sun is running out of energy. Don't worry about it. It's going to be well after you're dead before the sun runs out of energy. Okay? But the sun is running out of energy. But if you have an endless past, then the sun would have already run out of energy. It's like saying if you got a flashlight, okay, and the flashlight's running low on batteries, okay, and if I say, well, that flashlight's always been there, then it would have already run out of battery power, okay? So the scientific community is aware of this. All right, it frustrated Einstein at first when he did his theory of relativity, because the natural conclusion of that was the universe had to have a beginning, that time had to have a beginning, space and time itself had a beginning. So we know that nature has not always been here. The universe has not always existed. That makes the universe an effect, something that was caused to happen, something that began to exist. So premise A, every effect needs a cause. And I should add a sufficient cause. The cause has to be sufficient to bring that effect to be. Premise B, the universe is an effect because the universe began to exist. Conclusion, which by the way necessarily follows, is that the universe had a cause agent, and that cause agent had to be sufficient to bring into existence time, space, matter, and energy. It had to be able to do that. Now, think about this for a second. What is capable of bringing into existence time, space, matter, and energy? Something that is more powerful than time, that's timeless. Something that's more powerful than energy, all-powerful. Something that's greater than space itself, omnipresent. Something, and when you start thinking about that, does that sound familiar to you? Does that sound like somebody, that maybe we know? Okay? All right? So the argument for the cosmological argument is one of the best arguments for the existence of God. If you understand and accept the law of causality, it necessarily flows God, or at least some kind of supernatural causation agent, exists. Confirmed, irrefutable logic. The moral argument is that every human being, again, every effect needs a cause, premise A. Premise B, there is a moral awareness intrinsic in every human soul. Now, it's true that we can sear our conscience. It's true that we can be confused and manipulated and influenced by our culture and our upbringing and families and all of that. That's all true. But the argument here is that at its base, there's a moral awareness. And you can see this played out sociologically when you look at communities that have thrived and survived, religions that have lasted a long time. You can see certain common things, like the golden rule is taught pretty much in every major religion. You can see certain common moral laws that keep coming up. And if you ask the average person certain questions like, do you believe that torturing people for amusement is objectively right or objectively wrong? Most people, they think about that, would just instinctively say it's wrong. It's wrong, morally wrong. And you don't have to teach a child this, by the way. A child has someone steal their toy, it's wrong. Fundamentally wrong, okay? All right? I remember my cousin, when she was a baby, she was about 18 months, just learning how to walk. And she came up to me, and I was a teenager, about 15 at the time. She comes walking up to me and looks at me like this. All right? And I'm like, what in the world? My sister had stolen her toy. And so she knew to come to me. I was the enforcer, and I was going to get that toy back, because my cousin had been wronged, okay? I mean, people have that moral sense of a desire for justice and fairness. Now, where did this desire for justice and fairness come from? And don't tell me the survival instinct of Darwinian evolution answers that. Because frankly, if it's just about survival instinct, if it's all about survival, then I will stomp on you to get ahead, okay? So I can survive, all right? And so would you do the same to me and stuff. Now, there are people that live like that. I understand that, okay? They're true. Again, we get back to the conscience being seared, sin being in the world, okay? But the point is that the survival instinct cannot account for love, sacrifice, a sense of moral awareness, higher duty to your fellow man. It can't account for that. It can't. What can account for it is what Paul says in Romans, that God wrote the law in the human heart. Again, and I could go on and on and on. These are fun. Tons of arguments for the existence of God. Now, if a theistic God exists, then he chose to create the universe and the human race. And that makes us accountable to him. So if God exists, it's confirmed that we're here because of him, and that makes us accountable. We're accountable to him. We're his creation. And therefore, it's logical also to assume that he would want to reveal himself to us in some way. It's logical. It follows from that. Why would he create us and not want to interact with us in any way? You know, it's logical. And you can look at and see attributes of God in the creation. In the arguments I just laid out, all those arguments, you can see certain attributes of God. Look at those attributes. It logically follows that he would want to interact with us. He cares about us. And he would want to interact with us and have a relationship with us. And so, therefore, we look for signs of this revelation. Has God revealed himself to us then? Let's look and see which religion, which worldview best explains this revelation. Is there evidence for it? And that leads us to Jesus Christ, to Jesus himself. Now, when I went through my period of doubt many years ago, I came to this thing. It really came down to two things for me. And I'm not the brightest bulb in the lamp. I'm not the smartest guy in the world by any means. Many of you are much smarter than me. But I understand some common sense principles here. And I came down to a couple things for me. Does God exist? And is Jesus real? And did he rise from the dead? If those two things are true, everything else falls into place. Everything else falls into place. I can believe all the other stuff if those two things are true. So, Jesus. Here's what we know about Jesus. Now, by the way, this list we know about Jesus, we don't even have to look at the Bible to know this. Just looking at non-Christian sources on the life of Jesus of Nazareth, you can know he was a first-century religious leader, respected for a virtuous life, regarded and praised and claimed to be a miracle worker, acclaimed by many to be the Messiah, even God in the flesh, crucified under Pontius Pilate. His tomb was later found empty. His disciples claimed to their dying day that he rose from the dead, and Christianity spread rapidly as a result of that claim. These are historical facts, verifiable historical facts that you can get, and you don't even need to use the Bible to prove those facts. So then you look at, okay, what's the best explanation of these facts? Then you look at what the Bible says. Okay, how does the Bible explain these verifiable historical facts? What does the Bible say? And is the Bible credible to do it? Okay, one, I don't have time to get into this too much, but just understand there is more manuscript evidence for the New Testament than any other body of ancient literature, including Homer's Iliad, Julius Caesar's account of the Gallic Wars, biographies of Alexander the Great. There's more evidence backing up the authenticity of the Bible, that this book is really what the apostles wrote and what the prophets wrote, that we're holding in our hands today, an accurate reflection of what they wrote. There's more evidence backing that up than there is backing up the writings of other great Greek poets and historians and stuff that we generally accept. And so if the New Testament is historically reliable, and by the way, if you look at the book of Acts, for example, not only do we have an accurate copy, but the New Testament proves itself to be historically accurate over and over again. The book of Acts contains, last I counted, about 84 historical details that have been confirmed by archaeology and confirmed by other ancient sources outside the Bible. 84 historical details. There are about 60 or so historical figures referred to in the New Testament that we know are true. Figures like Pontius Pilate. By the way, for many years, critics of Christianity questioned that Pontius Pilate ever existed until archaeology found, oh yeah, he did exist. Maybe the Bible's right after all. And you can see that over and over and over and over again. We know if anyone comes to you and says the Bible is just a bunch of myths and fairy tales, you look up and say, really, is Pilate a fairy tale? Is Caesar Augustus a fairy tale? Is Tiberius Caesar a fairy tale? Are these guys myths and stuff? The Bible refers to all kinds of facts and people and figures that are absolute. Now this is important because it speaks to the credibility of the Bible. If you and I are going to make up a religion, let me tell you how we would do it. If we're going to make up a religion, we want to make up a story. If we make up a story, we want to make sure that no one can double check us and prove us wrong. So what we're going to do to make up a story is we're going to say something like, once upon a time, there was a man, and he did all these cool things, and he had these followers, and we're going to be very vague on the details. Very, very vague on the details. But that's not what the apostles did. Look, just real quick, look with me in Luke chapter 3. If you're making up a religion, you do not want to do this. Luke chapter 3. Luke chapter 3. Look at what Luke does. Starting in verse 1. Now, in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate being governor of Judea, Herod being tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip, tetrarch of Iturea, and the region of Trachonitis, and I cannot pronounce his name very well, Lysanias, whatever that is, tetrarch of Abilene, while Annas and Caiaphas were high priests, the word of God came to John, the son of Zacharias, in the wilderness. That does not sound like he's making stuff up. He is putting an address to it. And he's daring people, check me out. Check me out. The Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, you can write that passage down, talks about all the people that saw Jesus alive. He lists 500 people, refers to 500 people, most of whom are still alive. Paul's daring people to go talk to him. This is not made up. Now, if the New Testament is historically reliable and the evidence strongly indicates that it is, and I could go on and on and on about this, I wish I had time. But all kinds of reasons for it. One that Frank Turek loves to do, and I love to do, I'll just say this. One of the criteria that historians use to prove whether an ancient text is true or not is there embarrassing details in the ancient text about the authors. Because generally speaking, when the authors are making stuff up, they don't make themselves look bad. But if you read the Gospels, the disciples look kind of bad at times, okay? They're befuddled, confused. One of them betrays Jesus. One of them denies Jesus. I mean, you've got all kinds of embarrassing details in the Gospels. It passes historical validity tests. So if the New Testament's historically reliable, then we know that Jesus claimed to be God, and he did. He claims to be God, and his claim was then backed up by the resurrection itself. The resurrection itself. Now, people try to explain away the resurrection with hallucinations and stuff, but you don't have 500 hallucinations at the same event. There's no such thing as mass hallucinations. So the hallucination theory falls apart completely. It also doesn't explain, if people made this up, if the disciples stole the body and made it up, why did the disciples go to their grave? Why did they go to their grave? Testifying to their dying day that he rose from the dead. This is an important one. Chuck Colson, who was a Watergate figure, writes about this, and he says that when the Watergate scandal broke, everyone ran for the hills trying to save themselves. And they were willing to betray their colleagues and cut deals with prosecutors and tell-all books and everything to try to protect their reputation and keep themselves out of jail and prison. They were all about self-sacrifice, self-preservation, okay? But that's not the case with the disciples. The disciples, if they had made the stories up, if they had made everything up, why did they allow themselves to be beaten, crucified, tortured, sawed in half in some cases? Why did they allow themselves to be brutally executed and tortured if they knew what they were teaching was a lie? And I would submit to you that the only logical explanation of this is they knew what they were teaching to be true. They knew it was true. And that's why they were willing to go to their grave. That's how you can explain that Peter, who was cowardly on the eve of Jesus' crucifixion, would later stand up boldly amongst the same people that crucified Jesus and say, Jesus is the only way to salvation. That's why Peter was willing to get crucified upside down, and according to one church history account, watch his wife be crucified, because he knew it was true. He knew it was true. Conclusion, if God is real, the miracles of the Bible, including the resurrection, are possible. If God's real, miracles are possible. There's no way to get around that. And if Jesus really did rise from the dead, then it validates and confirms what he said about himself. Because not everyone rises from the dead, just so you know. It's a kind of a rare thing. So, if a person rises from the dead, they get my attention. That gives them instant credibility, okay? And it confirms what Jesus said about himself. And if the basics of the Christian gospel are true, then the rest of the New Testament not only becomes plausible, but likely. And if the New Testament's true, you get the Old Testament thrown in. The Old Testament's then true as well. And so, because that's like, say, you can't have World War II without World War I, you know what I mean? So basically, the claims that Jesus makes in the New Testament about the Old Testament, all those become true. Bottom line, folks, is that you stand on a firm foundation if you confess Jesus Christ, your Lord and Savior. Now, how does this help you? It doesn't take away all the pain in this life. There is still going to be pain and suffering. There's still going to be bad things that will happen to you. In fact, the Bible promises that some bad things will happen to you. It doesn't mean that everyone's going to accept. Jesus says that the broad is the way that leads to destruction. There will be some things that happen that you don't understand. There will be some questions that you have that you don't have all the answers to. And some of you that might be a hard thing for some of you. It's a hard thing for me, but basically, people that are type A and obsessive compulsive have a hard time with blanks that aren't filled in, and questions that aren't answered. I gotta fill these blanks in, so they can't do it. But the fact of the matter is, that's where faith comes in. If we can know that the basic facts of Christianity are true, then I think Jesus has earned the right to ask us to trust him. Not that he had to earn it. I'm not saying he did. But give the Lord credit here. He rose from the dead. All right? What more do you want from him? Think about it. Now, you may be going through a horrible tragedy right now. And in that case, we're going to wrap our arms around you and we're going to pray for you and we're going to love you. I can give you the theological answer as to why there's pain and suffering in the world. It's because there's sin. And the consequences of sin, Jesus says, reigns on the just and on the unjust. I can't answer why you specifically are going through pain and suffering right now. All I can do is say, I love you. And more importantly, God loves you. And we're here for you. The Bible says, weep with those who weep, rejoice with those who rejoice. And that's what we're going to do. But I can tell you this. You think the atheists have an answer to pain and suffering in the world? You think the atheists have an answer to this? Listen to this, and I'll close with this. And I'm sorry for going a little bit over, but this is very important, I think. If you just listen to what the atheists have to say, if I can pull up this quote here. This is from Bertrand Russell. Let me start off. This is Robert Crick, who's a famous molecular biologist and humanist. The astonishing hypothesis is that your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. That's what an atheist believes. Now, this is what Bertrand Russell says. The effects of Bertrand Russell was an atheist, by the way. This is what he says when it comes to hope and prayer. We stand on the shores of an ocean, crying to the night and the emptiness. Sometimes a voice answers out of the darkness, but it is a voice of one drowning, and in a moment the silence returns. That's the hope of an atheist.